And the view of General Bipin Rawat within the military had already become कि ये आदमी थोड़ा maverick आदमी है. Okay, he's going to go ahead and take decisions that will suit the army and they will not suit the air force. Then General Bipin Rawat, already enjoying this reputation of being a bit of a maverick, a guy who can take sort of rushed, sometimes reckless decisions, which is not the kind of man he was at all, but he was seen to be like that by the other forces. Said something in an India Today interview that it was like launching a nuclear attack on the other forces.
I remember this one.
You remember this? He was speaking to Gaurav Sawant. He gave an interview where he basically said that we should have the kind of theatrisation and jointmanship where the Air Force will be a support arm.
Yes.
He called the Air Force, for God's sake, a support arm.
Yeah, it blew up.
Okay, and that is like walking up to the Chief of Air Staff and slapping him. Okay, or lining up all your pilots and slapping them one by one. It's like, it's as humiliating as that. Calling the Air Force, for God's sake, the Air Force has won you wars.
Do naval fighter pilots think they're better and cooler than Air Force fighter pilots?
I'm going to get killed from both sides for saying this, but yes, they do. And yes, they are. Okay, because my apology to all my Air Force pilot friends, because you guys are rock stars. But look, there's no two ways around this.
Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Our Defense Season 2. It's been a very hectic week for Shiv and I, and I think Anna almost had a heart attack a couple of hours ago when Shiv once again messaged on our group that can be postponed for a few more hours. But she put her foot down, saying, no, hell no, not happening this time.
Because the only battles that are being fought right now, and I'm wondering whether one of our future episodes is going to be election related.
Yeah.
Because it's the only defense related topic that anyone is really talking about at this point in time. Everyone has forgotten defense. It's all about the elections now.
But we haven't forgotten about defense, which is why we are here, which is why Shiv did make the time out from his busy schedule and made sure that he was there for this recording. This week, we'll go to a topic which actually also involves a lot of politics, to the topic of reforms within the military and specifically the post of the Chief of the Defense Staff.
Yeah.
There are a lot of points I want to cover, but before we get to the realities, before we get to the present day situation, let's kind of go back to where this post came from, and I'd like Shiv to give us a perspective of where the recommendation originally came from. So the post was created in 2019. PM Narendra Modi in his speech from the Red Fort on Independence Day announced that the government would set it up. A few months later, on 31st December, General Bipin Rawat, who was then the Chief of the Army Staff, he was appointed as the Chief of Defense Staff. Lots of controversies there, but we'll get to that later. And unfortunately, I think around 2 years into his tenure, he died in an unfortunate helicopter crash in Tamil Nadu, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
And then for a few months, I think nearly for a year, the post was vacant.
9 months, in fact.
9 months. Yeah. And the current Chief of Defense Staff is, most people won't even know, General Anil Chauhan, who was previously the General Officer Commanding in Chief of the Eastern Command.
Yes.
He had retired and he was brought out of retirement. Like I said, before we get to the present day scenario, let's go back to Kargil War, because the recommendation comes from there. This mammoth page, I don't know how many pages, Subramanian report, one of several recommendations. I think Shiv has briefly touched upon them previously, how certain things that we're seeing today go back then. First, let's talk about what happened during the Kargil War that this committee felt the need to recommend the post in the first place.
So, the CDS and the Chief of Defense Staff issue, Dev, is an issue that's very close to my heart for multiple reasons, but also because the Subramaniam Committee report, also called the Kargil Review Committee, which was formed after the Kargil War of 1999, is when my career as a defense journalist actually began. It was in 2004. This review committee report had come out in I think 2001, 2002. So it was basically in the years after that report had come out that I started covering defense. And I can tell you at that time, the recommendations of the Kargil Review Committee, were the big headline as far as defense correspondents were concerned, because they were all really new and exciting recommendations. Because it was the first modern kind of unsparing take on how to improve the military, how to optimize the military, how to shed the fat, how to integrate them better, how to convert the military, from a kind of legacy, laggard bunch of organizations into fighting fit, lean, mean organizations that are, primed for war and, not just sitting around in cantonments and wasting their time. I'm being very blunt, but this is basically what it was. Now, one of the chief recommendations of this committee, like you rightly said, Dave, was that the Indian military requires a presiding chief who lords over all three services, called the Chief of Defence Staff. Now, the reason for this is, like everything else in the Kargil Review Committee, it was noted after this committee had gone through all the operational reports, the plans, etc., that went through. And Kargil was a very brief war. It lasted 50 days, right? But there were some very painful lessons from Kargil, because even though Kargil was a victory for India, we evicted the intruding Pakistan army. The Indian army lost over 500 men. It was by no means a happy occasion as far as India was concerned. Not just in terms of loss, but the implications in terms of intelligence failure, lack of preparations. But most glaringly, the Kargil Review Committee, Dev, and the reason why it recommended, for instance, the creation of a Chief of Defence Staff post was the multiple instances seen in the Kargil War of a very troubling lack of cohesion between the army and the air force specifically, and the Navy to a smaller extent. The Navy, of course, wasn't directly involved in any way in the Kargil war, but we're talking more at this point in terms of the army and the air force. And these were at multiple levels, from the tactical unit level to the use of armed helicopters, to simple inter-service command and control issues. Will they go? Will we go? That kind of thing. And during wartime, such chains of command have to be absolutely seamless. There can't be turf battles. There can't be, that's your job, not my job. Or we are the Air Force, we will do the air power bit, you look after your bit. I'm simplifying it, but I'm saying at the kind of granular tactical level, that's what it boiled down to. Plus a kind of inter-service distancing between each other, even at the top level, over who is supposed to plan better for these kinds of exigencies. And remember, both the Army and the Air Force were used extensively in the Kargil War. As a result of which, there was not only a lack of cohesion and integration in operations. This had a telling effect even on how India executed the war, because beyond the chest thumping of the Operation Vijay and the bravery of our incredible soldiers and air warriors of the time, there were very, very painful lessons to learn. Had integration been better, perhaps the war wouldn't have lasted so long. Perhaps we wouldn't have lost as many soldiers and officers as we did. And these are, any sane country will ask these difficult questions. And all of these were distilled down by K. Subramaniam, who is the father of Dr. S. Jaishankar, our current External Affairs Minister. As a matter of fact, our viewers may not know that. Is that integration, jointmanship? That's where the word jointmanship became a big buzzword in the Indian media. That the Indian armed forces were not joint enough. They ran at cross purposes at troubling times. There were competing interests. There were suboptimal overlaps of command and control issues, inter-services rivalries, and basically an unhealthy kind of existence with each other without making good use of each other. And K. Subramaniam, in his wisdom, had decided, after the committee had sat on this, that given that you're not going to be able to force the three services to suddenly overnight adhere together, work together, and backslap each other, as it were, metaphorically, and become one. Why not have a first among equals? Now, remember, around this time, there was already something called after the Kargil War, there was something called the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Okay. The Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee was basically one of the three chiefs. The senior most of them was, by virtue of his seniority, the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Now, it had a kind of cosmetic layer to it, because he was the senior most, but it didn't really mean anything practically on the ground, because even if you're the senior most of the three chiefs, you don't have any bearing on what the other two services actually do. In the aftermath of the Kargil war, there was something called the Integrated Defense Staff that was set up. Now, all of these things, Chairman, Chiefs of Staff Committee, Integrated Defense Staff, these were all kind of placeholder decisions that were taken by the governments that followed, because the Chief of Defense Staff position was a political and military hot potato. If you look at all parliament answers since 2000, till the time a decision was taken by the Modi government, every single answer about the CDS recommendation is identically the same. It says, we are working on political consensus. Political consensus has not been evolved on the issue of CDS, and therefore discussions are on it. And they just tallowed the issue for 2 decades, basically. Now, the problem with the creation of the CDS was that the three services, who are anyway not very joint, where it mattered, saw this as a bit of a threat. If you've got a CDS over us, who is that CDS going to be? Where is that CDS going to come from? Is it going to be a rotational CDS? Because remember, the recommendation had been made by the Subramaniam Committee, but it had not listed the modalities of how the CDS will be selected. Will it be rotational? Can it be from any of the services? What will be the tenure? What will be the terms of reference? What powers will they have? Will it be an operational role? Will it be an administrative role? What are their KRAs, etc.? None of that was fleshed out. It was just like, let's have one guy to oversee these three and try and bring them together, like a kind of father figure for the three services, and to try and integrate them a little bit. So for 20 painful years, absolutely nothing happened. There was no political consensus. I actually wonder whether an effort was made for political consensus, because it doesn't appear to me that the politicians were even interested in going ahead with something like this, because they thought the military is not interested in this. The military doesn't want a CDS. The military is saying, we're fine the way we are. We'll do our integrations and tri-service command, YEVO and all that. And, we'll work on jointmanship. So the military continuously gave whoever was in power at the time assurances that we will work on integration. But the CDS is it's not something that, they of course never overtly or openly opposed it or anything like that. Nobody would be seen to be doing that. But the sense was, no, we are the bosses. We don't need another boss over our head right now, right? All that changed, like you rightly said, in 2019 when General Bipin Rawat, having just retired as the Chief of the Army Staff, was appointed as the first Chief of Defense Staff. He took over, I think, on the 1st of January 2020, just before the COVID pandemic. So we'll talk more about what the position of CDS has actually achieved. But this is the kind of long and slightly agonized saga of the CDS and why it was deemed necessary.
I think everything with the Indian military seems always long and agonizing.
As
far as reforms are concerned.
Without exception.
Yeah. All right. So again, before we move on to what the CDS has achieved and what Bipin Rawat in his office, General Bipin Rawat, the steps he wanted to bring, the reforms he wanted to bring, where do they stand? We'll come to that later. But now I want to go to a slight segue, the controversial bit of the appointment of General Bipin Rawat himself. Announcement is made during the Independence Day speech, then silence. No one knows what's happening. The assumption was that the army would get the first. I think it was very well known that the first two CDSs would be from the Indian Army because of just sheer numbers and because it's the largest military arm of your country. The assumption mostly was that General Bipin Rawat would take over as the CDS, but he was getting closer to retirement. No announcement at all from the government. There was also a contender. I forgot his name. He was then the commander of the Northern Army. Lieutenant General Ranveer something, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, I think lots of speculation among journalists, all the buzz. On 31st December, late evening, I remember because I was in office and it flashed in front of our system, the software used to flash information. A blank paper, no letterhead, nothing, just says that, General Bipin Rawat, his various medals, is appointed as a CDS until further notice. It's not even a tenure. Which led to a lot of criticism, speculation that was this post created only for General Bipin Rawat, because you have to remember that General Bipin Rawat was seen as somebody who was liked by the Modi government, because in 2016, when he took over as Chief of Army Staff, he superseded two senior
Right.
officers. Very rare. I think the only instance I could find of a supersession in the Indian Army was under Indira Gandhi. So he was seen as the government's favorite. So the questions were raised that, maybe this post was made only for him. Back then, I did not believe that at all. I thought this was actually a revolutionary move because, like you, I've been also hearing about the CDS thing since when I was growing up. I think the Modi government was, had finally taken the plunge that other governments had failed to. Great. But then, unfortunately, he dies. And for 9 months, you have nothing on it. Reinforcing the speculation, the criticism that this post was created only for General Bipin Rawat, and the government didn't really want to go to the nitty-gritties of
Yes.
the reforms, etc. And now you have General Anil Chauhan as the CDS, but he doesn't make a lot of noise. I'm guessing that could also be the personality, because I think General Bipin Rawat was very outgoing. I remember you wrote a piece recently where you recounted how he was the one who actually made your first book happen.
Yeah.
By giving you access to the officers who were involved in the surgical strikes against Pakistan. His personality was such, I think. So yeah, your take on this, because the way all this has happened since his unfortunate death has raised a lot of questions once again.
Look, there's no doubt in anyone's mind, and nobody will beat around the bush on this issue that General Bipin Rawat was deep selected by the government. They spotted his character, his capability, his talent. Many other factors may have come into play, but you're right. The fact that General Bipin Rawat was appointed Chief of Army Staff over two senior officers, Lieutenant General Praveen Bakshi and one more officer whose name I forget, who was the Southern Command Chief at that time, it ruffled a lot of feathers. When you sort of sidestep the seniority principle in the armed forces, even though it is not a stipulated system of appointing, the appointment of the chiefs is entirely the political prerogative. The government has the full power to appoint whoever they want as the chief of the army staff, or the chief of the air staff, or the chief of the naval staff. But the legacy system has always been seniority, and it stands to reason that the seniority principle is a good one, because you've come to that position by a constant system of reviews every single year, and therefore when you reach that position, obviously the system has ensured the best, the creme de la creme, as it were, of the armed forces have reached that position, and therefore it stands to reason that the senior most becomes the chief if they if they meet the criteria in terms of residual service, etc. So to sidestep that position is always a controversial situation. It happened once with General Vaidya as far as Indira Gandhi was concerned. It happened on another occasion, if I remember correctly. I'm unable to recall where. And then finally with General Bipin Rawat in 2016. Now, the controversy of the decision aside, and it was a political decision. There were there was a lot of heat within the army about this decision, etc. But at the end of the day, everyone had to fall in line because it's a decision. A decision is a decision, and there was nothing illegal about it. Now, let's also remember that it's not like General Bipin Rawat was undeserving of the position.
Yes.
He was totally, he was fully capable of performing that job. He was eligible for the job. There was no question of him being randomly selected for it. He was, as the vice chief, as the Eastern Command chief, he had overseen India's famous Myanmar surgical strike. He was the vice chief when the Uri surgical strikes happened under General Dalbir Singh Suhag, the army chief of that time, and then he was made the army chief. Now, my sense is, and I think most people share this sense, Dev, that the government, General Bipin Rawat was seen to be close to the government. Okay, in a military milieu where there's a one-arm distance between the armed forces and the military, General Bipin Rawat was seen to be someone who was, had a good rapport with Prime Minister Modi, a very good rapport with Doval, who was from the same state in Uttarakhand. And we can go into a whole separate episode on all the conspiracy theories of the Uttarakhand mafia and the Ministry of Defense, etc. But that's a separate issue altogether. But the fact is, General Bipin Rawat was a highly capable, credible officer who had cut his teeth in operations. He'd served in United Nations missions abroad as a brigadier. So he's a war-fighting general. He knows what he's talking about. It's not like it was favoritism or nepotism or anything like that. And there will be those who will point fingers and say, yes, but he's from Uttarakhand, or yes, he's from this particular regiment, etc. All of those things, something of that kind can be said about virtually all senior appointments in the military. Let me tell you, that's how it actually works. And if you think that gossip culture doesn't exist in the military as far as appointments are concerned, you'd be wrong. It's probably even more over there. Okay, and it doesn't help that the seniority principle is sidestepped.
Yeah.
So this became a hot potato. It became the biggest living room discussion in the forge for months together. General Bipin Rawat being elevated over two other senior generals. As Chief of the Army Staff, General Bipin Rawat was there, overseeing different kinds of operations in the aftermath of the Uri surgical strike. He had already begun to, sort of rise above his station, and not in a bad way. I mean, he already was presenting a kind of vision to the government in terms of how the armed forces can actually come together.
Right.
So he was the Chief of the Army Staff, but he was also, the army is the largest of the three forces. So in essence, the army chief is sort of rightly or wrongly seen as the first among equals, even though he may not be the senior most, right? Because he commands the largest force, the biggest responsibilities, rightly or wrongly. And therefore, and his proximity to the government meant that they were listening to what he said. So he had a lot of good ideas in terms of the now big buzzword theatrisation.
Yes.
And things like that right from the get-go. So I think that conversation had already sort of begun. And I think the government, when it saw Bipin Rawat sort of evolving from a chief-like figure or just a military figure into a larger sort of manager of the armed forces, a person, I think the Modi government then realized this would be the time to bring the CDS to life, because now we finally see a man who fits that role. All this while they were not even talking about the conversation for 20 years or the decision-making loop for 20 years is should we or should we not? They were not even thinking about we'll do it when we find the right guy to do it. I think this government kind of flipped that question on its head. It may have been thinking about it even since 2014. Who knows? And they thought we'll dust it off the shelf in the MOD. Once we find jab acha banda aata hai, then we will decide on appointing a CDS. And I think they saw that in Bipin Rawat. And when that happened, you saw how fast the ball rolled.
Yes.
August announcement, Jan 1st, 2020, 31st December, like you said, that unsigned flash appears. And 1st of January, the man is already the CDS. He took I was there at Vijay Chowk when he took over on in front of the Ministry of Defense. So I think that's really how it actually worked. It was a deep selection. The political powers that be saw in General Bipin Rawat someone who is capable of kind of expanding above being just a chief of the army staff and embracing that much larger role that the CDS could have.
Yeah. Right. We'll move to the present now and what this post has achieved with the second CDS being in place now. I think now it's been around almost 4 years since we have this post. The challenges still that this post faces to bring the military arms together, and whether there is any jointmanship within the military. But we'll at that after a quick break.
The army has very cleverly engineered, this sort of a hung assembly where the PTI independents are in the lead because it believes that ultimately it can get these independents to defect. And that would be a bigger public embarrassment for Imran Khan to see his people who claim to be so righteous defect to other parties while he's just sitting helpless in jail.
Anna, there are a few things that have happened in these elections. One, a celebration of the people's mandate, the adult franchise, where people have voted irrespective of what the establishment wanted. Now, we know that and why do I say that? Because in 2018, the very same Imran Khan was propped up by the army.
Exactly.
And everything was made to work to ensure that Imran Khan wins. But he did carry a lot of weight. He did start this entire people's movement and brought a lot of people together. So the votes were not, there were reports of rigging, but it was not to the scale that we saw this time around, right? So he did manage to get people behind him. To the extent that this time around, when he is not the army's choice, the people are still standing behind him. The mandate is very clear. The single largest party is that of Imran Khan's. But they all fought not under the bat symbol, not as PTI, but as independents, since their bat was stripped off. The bat symbol was stripped off. And someone very interestingly had written in one of the columns that this is Imran Khan scoring nearly a century without a bat.
Welcome back. Shiv and I are discussing the legacy of the Chief of the Defence Staff post, a post that was established just around 4 years ago, and the larger question of reforms within the military, jointmanship within the different military wings, that whether it's the Army, Air Force, or the Navy. Before we go to the rivalries bit, I want to focus briefly on what the post has achieved for the 2 years that General Bipin Rawat was in office, and for the I forgot how many months or years General Anil Chauhan has been in office, because it's also a very complicated post, right? Because it's not as though the CDS is the army chief's boss, technically speaking.
Not at all.
The CDS won't really direct the army chief to do something, but if, and this is a topic we'll obviously get into, but if the whole idea of theatrisation would surface, then I think that would kind of become, the CDS would be the one fighting the wars, the army chief would be the one giving the supplies in terms of whether it's manpower or other equipment, right? Ensuring that all the equipment is well taken care of, training gets done, these guys are well trained, etc. And when the need arises, the unit is sent to a particular command whose boss is the local, I'm guessing senior most, or whoever, the officer could be from any of the services who reports to the CDS. Complicated because it's not happened. We don't exactly know how it'll happen. But so take us through this. As of right now, and also the second part of this, being the chief guy who will ensure like a common procurement for all the militaries, because this one thought that struck me when I was doing my research, like why is there a need for the army and the air force both to buy Prachand helicopters? I can get the navy having a helicopter division, I can get the navy having fighter jets, because the navy operates in a different terrain. They operate over water, so they need officers and sailors who know how to live on a ship, survive in water. But when you're launching assets from land into air, attacking a target, why do you need the army to also have an aviation wing? The CDS, I'm guessing, was supposed to sort of synergize all of this with the theatre commons, etc. So yes, Shiv, take us through what the CDS ka post does today, what the dream was, and where do we stand with what the dream was?
Well, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that the CDS post, and this isn't the fault of either the CDS or the system. It's I like with all things in the Indian military and Indian political system, it's a combination of many factors. But so far, the CDS post hasn't achieved as much as perhaps 4 years ago it was hoped it would. Now, the very tragic death of General Bipin Rawat in many ways, was a huge speed bump, because General Bipin Rawat was a very energetic, he was a doer, right? He was a guy who got things done. He had that energy about him to, not only did he have ideas, but the government had kind of empowered him with the powers to go ahead and do what he thought up as good ideas. And theatrisation, like I said, was, it wasn't General Bipin Rawat's idea. It was an idea that had come many, many years before, but it appealed to him as, this would be the big ticket, the very reason for a CDS. If a CDS is to justify his position, it would be if he made theatrisation a reality. Now, I'll come to the modalities of theatrisation in just a bit and where we are as far as that is concerned. But just to add to your point, which is a very important one and bears repeating over and over again, the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff, is not the boss of the Army Chief, the Navy Chief, and the Air Chief. They do not report to him. The Chief of Defence Staff doesn't have an operational role as far as military operations or military intelligence or things like that are concerned. So actual fighting, war fighting, defense issues, the CDS actually has nothing to do with those. The Chief of Defence Staff is a kind of, like I said, a kind of a kind of higher boss of the larger future forward higher defense reforms role. A person who's got this big drone's eye view of the armed forces and is constantly looking for ways to make them more cohesive, more optimal, to make them more lethal, to save more money by being more, optimized, and to therefore create a kind of much more agile war machine, rather than the kind of legacy laggard systems that we are used to. The Indian army is 1.1 million strong. And in General Bipin Rawat's famous words, he would have liked to see the army, come down to half that size. And that raised a lot of eyebrows. Believe you me, it raised a lot of eyebrows. But his kind of value system, as it were, as far as the military was concerned, is that you can't sustain such a large military force. It needs to be, in this age of technology and automation, manpower, woman power needs to be brought down. You need to optimize in big ways so that you're much more agile. Now comes the issue of theatrization. Now, theatrization became kind of synonymous with CDS because theatrization was seen as the kind of visible, quantifiable reform that a chief of defense staff can execute for the armed forces. Now, let me simplify the reason for this for our listeners. One is the Indian armed forces currently have single service commands. Apart from two commands, which are tribe service commands, all our other commands right now of the military are all single service commands. The Air Force and the Army have 7 single service commands each. So, like, for example, the Air Force has the Western Air Command, Eastern Air Command, Central Air Command, Southwestern Air Command, Southern Air Command, Training Command, and things like that. The Army has the Western Army Command, Northern Army Command, Eastern Army Command, and things like that. The Navy has 3 commands, which is Eastern, Western, and Southern. Now, in the aftermath of Kargil, when jointmanship and tri-service integration became the big, the big shadow over the armed forces, two new commands came up. One was called the Andaman and Nicobar Command, which is a tri-service command, and the other was the Strategic Forces Command, which is basically India's nuclear command. It's not a military command; it's a nuclear command. It's a strategic. It's basically for strategic deterrence. So there's no military aspect to it, apart from the fact that it is headed by a military officer.
And I think he reports directly to the government and not
to the cabinet secretariat and to the government, right? So currently India has 2 tri-services commands, and it has 17 single service commands. Nothing else right now. Now, the object of theatrization is to say that, look, having these single service commands only reinforces the sense of separation between all your forces. What is the point of having separate Air Force commands and separate Army commands in kind of similar areas of the country? Shouldn't we be having something called theater commands? Now, what does theater mean? Theater basically means one large specific block of territory. Now, the idea and the rationale behind a theater command is that make your military or optimize your military in such a way that it is theater specific, not Air Force specific or Navy specific or Army specific. Now, under the theatrization push, instead of the focus being having all these 17 different single service commands, we will basically have 3 theater commands. You will have a Pakistan specific theater command, which will be headquartered in Jaipur. You will have a China specific theater command, which will be located in Lucknow, headquartered in Lucknow. And you will have a maritime theater command, which takes care of all your ocean territories, which will be headquartered in Karwar, which is in coastal Karnataka. So these are the 3 theater commands that were mota decided by the CDS at the CDS level that we will work towards them. Under the CDS, certain functional commands were also thought of, which could be tri-service, like an air defense command, a special forces command, a cyber security or a cyber attacker, a cyber army command, that kind of thing, which works only on AI and cyber, cyber threats, etc. Now, those are in various levels of progress right now. But the theatrization push met with multiple roadblocks for, ironically, the very reason why it was being pushed, which is that there were inter-services suspicions. Under this new regime of theatre, will one become more powerful than the other? Should we say yes now or wait and watch? Armed forces love to wait and watch. They love it. They don't want to commit to anything before they know everything, because the smallest of decisions at the political level change, decades of legacy structures in the armed forces. So nobody wants to say, ha, theek hai, chalo, let's do this. And the view of General Bipin Rawat within the military had already become कि ये आदमी थोड़ा maverick आदमी है. Okay, he's going to go ahead and take decisions that will suit the army and they will not suit the air force. Then General Bipin Rawat, already enjoying this reputation of being a bit of a maverick, a guy who can take sort of rushed, sometimes reckless decisions, which is not the kind of man he was at all, but he was seen to be like that by the other forces. Said something in an India Today interview that it was like launching a nuclear attack on the other forces.
I remember this one.
You remember this? He was speaking to Gaurav Sawant. He gave an interview where he basically said that we should have the kind of theatrization and jointmanship where the Air Force will be a support arm.
Yes.
He called the Air Force, for God's sake, a support arm.
Yeah, it blew up.
Okay, and that is like walking up to the Chief of Air Staff and slapping him. Okay, or lining up all your pilots and slapping them one by one. It's like, it's as humiliating as that. Calling the Air Force, for God's sake, the Air Force has won you wars.
Yes.
And calling it a support arm. So me being the person with all the luck in the world was interviewing the Chief of Air Staff right after Gaurav interviewed General Bipin Rawat. Okay, this was part of a seminar, and I had to interview Air Chief Marshal Rakesh Bhadoria right after that. Now, thankfully for me, and credit to Air Chief Bhadoria, he's a very sober, nice kind of, unemotional kind of person. Very straight talker, and unlike General Bipin Rawat, who's very energetic and he gets emotional and things like that, General Bhadoria was the opposite. He said yes, I heard what General Bipin Rawat said and this, that and the other. You see, these are conversations that will continue, etc. And he totally played the story down and kind of saved me and saved the situation, because I didn't want it, as someone on India Today, I didn't want it to seem like we are making the chiefs fight, right?
Yes.
We're making the CDS and the air chief fight and stuff like that, anti-nationals and all that. So we kind of did that. But that interview lit a really big fire. And it confirmed everyone's worst fears about General Bipin Rawat. The entire Air Force said, देखा, हमने बोला तो था कि यही है इस आदमी का मकसद. He wants to subjugate the Air Force. He wants to make the Air Force a second-class service. So it in many ways kind of confirmed people's prejudices against General Bipin Rawat and stuff. Obviously, what he meant, in my view, was a little more complicated and layered and nuanced than just saying, no, ye second class hai. It wasn't that. He meant it in a different way, but his words kind of were nuclear, right? So, and this was many months before his death.
Yes.
So I can tell you, this interview caused a big speed bump already in the theatrization process, because it kind of quantified and placed on record what was going on in his mind as far as what the end game of theatrization was likely to look like. And so there were issues. And the government was also very clear that we're not going to rush through or push through theatrization without absolute consensus, because we can't be playing around with this. This is ultimately your war fighting saman. This is your war fighting machine. So failure is not an option. We have to get it right the first time. And therefore it kind of went into the back burner. When General Rawat died in that helicopter crash, everything came to an absolute standstill, because this was a man who kind of embodied the entire impulse of theatrization in his kind of brain, in his mind, in his thought process, in his work. That theatrization was alive in him. Everyone else was just executing what he was saying. So the kind of fountainhead of theatrization was suddenly silenced. He was gone. And there was complete shock. There was shock because it was suddenly like a black hole. Theatrization was in sight, but then the guy who was like the linchpin, the guy who was driving the whole thing was gone and you couldn't do anything about it. How do we start again? And that explains, Dev, why it took so long for the government to appoint the next CDS. Because even the government was like, we haven't even been sort of monitoring what's going on, right? We had entrusted this all to General Bipin Rawat. He'd been, he was riding the horse. He was riding the theatrization horse. So now we don't know what to do. So the government was at a bit of a loss, and that explains the 9 months it took to appoint a different person. And as you can see, they had to change the rules to bring an officer out of retirement. There was a lot of buzz whether, one of the current chiefs would become the CDS. All of those things happened. And now with even retired officers possible to, go from being a lieutenant general to a 4-star, the doors have been opened very widely. But as a last point, to give you a sense of where things are at as far as theatrization is concerned, in August last year, in 2023, and this was the last time something significant happened, was something called the ISO bill was passed in the Rajya Sabha.
Oh, yes.
This is the Inter-Services Organization Command, Control and Discipline Bill of 2023. Sounds very fancy, but it's actually a very, very kind of nuts and bolts bill, which basically means that in tri-services organizations, the Army, Navy and Air Force each function under what are called the Navy Act, the Army Act and the Air Force Act, which are a separate and non-overlapping set of rules. Now, in a tri-service organization before this bill was passed, if I was a Navy operational commander of a tri-service organization, I have very limited administrative command and disciplinary power over officers or people in my organization who are not from my service.
Right.
So I can do that with the Navy guys in my organization. But if an Air Force or an Army guy is there, can you imagine how silly this sounds? That in a tri-service organization as the operational commander, I don't have those powers. So
like a scene from the Yes Minister.
2023, they passed that bill, for God's sake. And we've had tri-services organizations for like 15, 16, 17 years. Okay, so it's bizarre. I mean, I don't even know. I feel like crying sometimes thinking about it, but crying solves nothing in Indian defense, okay? Because you just have to wait or you will cry some more. So this bill has been passed now. And with this bill, the kind of contours have been now set for theatrization. Ki, acha, theek hai. Ab ye nuts and bolts issue ho gaya hai ki operational commanders of tri-services organizations have administrative command, control, disciplinary powers over all the men and women under their operational command. And therefore, now we can move towards that kind of theatrization. When that theatrization happens, nobody knows. The contours have been set. The plans are there because General Bipin Rawat had done pretty detailed studies. He'd commissioned very detailed studies. But the question now is in terms of the political will to go ahead and execute them. The reason why things have become difficult is in the aftermath of the CDS being formed. Remember that just 5 months after the General Bipin Rawat took over a CDS, the standoff with China began. Okay. Now, when you have an live operational war front scenario, taking large reform decisions in your military become exponentially more difficult because your military is already committed, towards an operational front, that is Eastern Ladakh in this case. And therefore, you can't be taking drastic, large-scale, structural and reform decisions because those parts are not going to be able to move and shift according to what your new designs are going to be. And so, therefore, things are a little stuck as far as theatrization is concerned. So, we'll have to see how that moves forward. Just to close this thought, because you brought up the excellent example of the Prachand, and, the issue of attack helicopters is kind of emblematic of the absolutely ridiculous levels of lack of jointmanship, lack of optimization in our armed forces. This war between the Air Force and the Army over who should control simple attack helicopters has been running for 2 decades now or more. And it is an example of how the simplest of things can be for such a long time fall prey to turf battles, egos and things like that. Now, technically speaking, attack helicopters should be the preserve of the army, because attack helicopters are not instruments of air power. They are battlefield machines, because they fly low, they fly close to the troops.
units, yeah.
They're there for close air support. They're not fighter jets or bombers which are projecting air power. Air power is a very different thing. A helicopter or attack helicopter is a battlefield system, which is why in the United States, their attack helicopters, all their Apaches, are part of the US Army. They're not part of the US Air Force. The US Air Force is bombers and stealth and long range air power projection. Now, the old Soviet attack helicopters that used to be part of the Indian Army had Indian Air Force pilots flying them, because the Indian Air Force pilots said, no, let them be with the army, but we'll fly them.
Wow.
Now you've got the Prachand that's being bought by both the army and the Air Force, because the government still hasn't taken a decision on putting its foot down and saying, no, all attack helicopters will from now on be only part of the army. Take a decision one way or the other. It should be with the army, but if you're unable to decide on that, take a decision and give it all to the Air Force then. Let it be optimized in that sense. Let one service control attack helicopters. Before this, you had the Apache helicopters, 22 of which have been supplied to the Indian Air Force, but now 6 are being built for the army. Why? What is the point of this? 6 is a ridiculously measly number.
Yeah.
You're going to be situating them or locating them somewhere else. All that additional expense of having to maintain them in a separate location, when the Air Force already knows how to maintain them, is a kind of burning and crying example of of jointmanship at its worst. If you can't get something as basic as the utilization of armed helicopters right, how are you going to integrate at the larger theater level? Is one of the scares. The good news, and since I started with bad news, I'll end with the good news, is that most officers believe that the armed helicopter issue has been a legacy issue which has many layers to it, but theatrization will work because the armed forces don't have a choice. With shrinking budgets, and thankfully it's the spreadsheet that finally dictates what the armed forces must do. With shrinking budgets, they have no choice but to unite, because they don't have the luxury anymore of saying, मुझे ये चाहिए, मुझे वो चाहिए, मुझे 30 ड्रोन चाहिए, मुझे वो इतने tanks चाहिए. Nobody has that choice anymore. All procurements going forward will have to be joint procurement plans, and therefore theatrization is an imperative. It will happen. It has to happen.
Yeah, that's a nice positive note on which you ended your answer. And as we bring this episode to a close, I want to just briefly talk about the personal rivalry. I'm not saying personal as a man-to-man rivalries, but personal rivalries between the three forces, and how would that impact jointness? How would that impact serving in the same command? Like you mentioned, that bill that has been brought in. But at the personal level, you, apart from, let's say, the guys who've come from the NDA, they've spent maybe 3 years together, but you've spent your entire career in a particular force. So the suspicion that, for example, Air Force had for General Bipin Rawat is because that guy had spent his entire life in one particular military arm. How does that person then understand, in the other services view, the needs and the requirements of, let's say, the Navy or, let's say, the Air Force? I think General Bipin Rawat had also made another controversial statement with respect to the Navy when he said they should not get a third aircraft carrier. They can use the Andaman Nicobar Islands as an aircraft carrier. So how does that how do you integrate the person, the officers from the different arms at the personal level?
No, see, the thing is, the 3 chiefs very often are from the same batch, and like with the last 2 batches of chiefs we've seen, they're from the same course, and they knew each other. They were friends in the academy together. It's rare when that actually happens, but when it does happen, it really helps. And imagine going to the academy together and then rising to be chiefs together, right? That must be like one for the history books. But that personal equation is very necessary. It's important to remember that while it's tempting to see General Bipin Rawat as having spent his entire life as in the army and rising up to be the chief of the army staff, that he what can he possibly know about what's happening in the Air Force? That's not necessarily true, because right through service, starting from the NDA, where you're mixing with people who are going to go to all different arms and you're getting exposure to all different arms right from the academy level, right through your service, there are There are, joint exercises happening. There's a lot of joint training that takes place. There's a lot of, at the tactical unit sort of level, there are lots of exchanges that take place. There are courses that happen, higher command and, midterm courses that take place for officers where they're completely mixing with officers of the Navy and Air Force, etc. So that kind of cross-pollination is taking place. In fact, one of the decisions which I missed out on that the CDS has taken is also about a kind of lower level system of cross-posting of officers between the three services. So they get to spend time as young officers in their other things, which answers your question.
Yes.
So it's been kind of formalized now. Earlier, it only used to happen during joint exercises or seminars or courses, but now you will get to actually serve a tenure as an army officer in the Air Force or an Air Force officer in the army. You will see some cosmetic changes also. They've common uniforms, common battlefield, combat fatigues, etc. All of these things are meant to kind of downplay the differences between the forces and to emphasize commonality, a unity of purpose, the fact that you're all one fighting machine, and things like that. So yeah, the personalities of the three chiefs most certainly helps, but it's not like it's not as if one person's misgivings about another, if any, can affect systems, because these are men who are sitting in offices that have a large number of checks and balances. They control huge organizations that are unfathomable for most of us. Imagine commanding an organization 1.1 million strong, you being the presiding commander of a organization of 1.1 million people. So it's unimaginable. So the responsibilities are huge. A lot rests on the kind of dynamic that you enjoy with your fellow chiefs, etc. But I think the structures that have been put in place, and especially the structures that will happen going forward with theatrisation, I think will in many ways sort of soften some of the edges, blur out some of those differences that have existed in the past. Because suspicion between the armed forces over who is going to be the first among equals, who is the bigger one, is going to take a long time to get over it. Even now when we see our international, joint exercises, etc., there's a great emphasis on it. China in 2016 converted all its single service commands into 5 or 6 theater commands. It's the Western Theater Command that we are fighting with in Ladakh right now. So it's not like China had this bright idea of theatrisation long back and we are late to the table. They just did it in 2016. Their advantage is that they're able to do it much faster because they don't have the, and we've said this so many times in our defense, they don't have the inconveniences of democracy and clearances and this army chief doesn't like this issue and stuff. It's like one instruction, it has to be implemented. Karna hai to karna hai. So China has those advantages and they've implemented it. 2016 it was announced. By 2018 they had all their theater commands up and running, fully functional. So if China can do it, there is no reason why India can't do it. Yeah. We're just going through the motions and the failure is not an option kind of phase right now.
Yeah. One small last trivia question on the topic of rivalries. Simple one sentence answer, I think. You must have met both of them. Do naval fighter pilots think they're better and cooler than Air Force fighter pilots?
I'm going to get killed from both sides for saying this, but yes, they do. And yes, they are. Okay, because my apology to all my Air Force pilot friends, because you guys are rock stars. But look, there's no two ways around this. Navy fighter pilots fly over the sea.
Yes.
Okay, so that's badass anyway. Secondly, carrier pilots, Navy pilots who are landing on carriers are landing on a carrier deck. It's a tiny little runway the size of a matchbox, which they are looking at visually and landing. They've got to land on it while it's pitching and rolling on a rough sea. So they're landing on a runway that's literally moving in front of them, not staying steady. Yes. They've got to be able to land sometimes in very, very rough weather when things are moving dramatically. And they've got, very few chances to get it right. They've got limited fuel on their aircraft. So it's not like, I've missed the ship, so let me go back to land and land. If they don't, they've got to punch out of their aircraft. and the amazing beauty of an aircraft carrier. And this is a small little factoid for our listeners, which is that unlike landing on land, when you slow down and land and you put the brakes on, just before you touch down on a carrier deck, you actually increase speed
Yes.
to maximum, because if you miss the arrestor wire, you need enough
need
power
to
to
take
take off
off.
again.
Yeah.
So it's counterintuitive and kind of suicidal. But yeah, Navy fighter pilots are absolutely the greatest. I will say this at the risk of losing all my Air Force friends, but yes.
Let's see how they respond to you after this episode is released this week. Great. Thanks, Shiv. I think to kind of sum it up, what Shiv has described for us is that Big Bang reform, yes. Took very long, yes. When General Bipin Rawat was in office, things were happening at a very frantic speed, but his unfortunate death and some of the suspicions that he pointed out have slowed things down. But things are still happening slowly, steadily. They're happening, and we'll keep a watch in our defense, and we'll track and discuss the latest developments as and when they happen. Thanks, Shiv, once again.
Thanks, Dev.
Lovely episode, a great discussion, and I knew it would be a great fun chat. I was waiting for a discussion on this. Thanks as always to our producer Anna Priyadarshini, and to our listeners and viewers. Do leave us feedback, do leave us comment, do leave us ratings. If you're watching us on YouTube, leave a comment on the comment section. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a rating. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with our passport. Bye bye.